So I'm going to introduce our guest speaker right now. Professor Ingrid Rowland is a professor in the School of Architecture and History Department at the University of Notre Dame. She teaches primarily in Rome, but in the recent years, you've seen her on main campus as she is here this spring, and we're taking advantage of the fact that she's here to give a lecture for our brown bag lunch sessions. Ingrid writes and lectures on classical antiquity, the Renaissance, and the age of the Baroque, among other topics. A frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books, she's the author of numerous books, including, and the list is very long, but I'm just going to identify a few that her recent authorships. The Culture of the High Renaissance, Ancient and Modern in the 16th Century Rome by Cambridge in 1998. The Scarlet of Scornello, A Tale of Renaissance Forgery, University of Chicago, 2004. Giordano Bruno, philosopher from, which was, God is a recipient in 2009 of the Society of Italian Historical Studies, Howard R. Mazzaro Prize. Am I pronouncing this right? Mararo Prize. From Pompeii, this is one of my favorite ones. From Pompeii, The Afterlife of a Roman Town, with Harvard in 2013. The Collector of Lives, Giorgio Vasari and the Invention of Art, Norton, 2017. Translations of Vitruvius, 10 Books of Architecture. Students use this quite often, 1999. And then her latest book, The Divine Spark of Syracuse, 2018. Professor Rowland has previously taught at the University of Chicago, UCLA, and Columbia, as well as for the Rome program at St. Mary's College and the University of California, Irvine. After completing her BA in Classics at Panoma College, she earned her master's and PhD degree in Greek literature and classical archaeology at Bryn Mawr College. She has been a fellow of the American School of Classic Studies at Athens, the American Academy of Rome, the Villa Tati in Florence, and the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. So all the names possible of good fellowships, she's covered them all. She's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and was awarded an honorary doctor for fine arts from Panoma College in 2008. We thank you all for joining us today, and I welcome Ingrid Rowland for her talk this afternoon. Thank you.
And what I'm actually going to do today is show you what I hope is a reasoned argument about a person who made insane arguments based on evidence. And when the evidence was insufficient to sustain his insane arguments, he made some of the evidence up, and that's called forgery. And so what we have is somebody who's a forger, but he's also an architect. And as you'll see, there's a secret agenda behind his architecture. And often the paradigm, especially at this university for research, because they want to fund things and get big grants to say they earned so many dollars of grants, it will be evident from the fact that I've held all these grants that I am now the least eligible person on campus to get anything because I've already had it. And what they do after you've had it is make you read applications. So I am an extremely busy application reader for all these things that I've had the benefit of, which is really fun because it gives you a way of keeping up with recent trends in research and has its own lessons to learn. So one of the things that I spent October doing was being a reader for the Marie Curie Fellowships of the European Union, which have this whole bureaucratic procedure that makes anything bureaucratic in Italy look almost smooth. And the fascinating thing is that it actually works. All that bureaucracy has a meaning and finally worked nicely. But mostly the kind of research I do now is a stealth investigation someplace. And so this is a stealth investigation that began last spring in Malta because my Maltese friends said, we haven't been there for a while, we want to see you. So I thought I need an excuse to go to Malta. And I'd been interested in this man, Giorgio Grognet Vasse, for some time, and he seemed like the perfect excuse to go see my Maltese friends. Malta, for those of you who don't know it, and I recommend that everybody should go see it because it's one of the strangest places on the planet. Andrew's smiling because he knows all about its mystery, so ask him. He knows how great it is. You can see it's right below Sicily, and it's almost exactly halfway in the Mediterranean. If you go see The Tempest today at Washington Hall, I think maybe Malta is Prospero's desert island. At least I'm working on that hypothesis these days. And it belonged for many years to the Knights of Malta, who were a sovereign military order. This is what it looks like today. You can see the airstrip is 1/6 the length of the big island. So we're talking about a not very big place with 450,000 people crammed on it. There are more Maltese out of Malta than there are in Malta. And they can't all come back because there's no room for them. And it's just a wild and crazy place, which is why I love it so much. Here's a map, and we're going to be dealing with the capital, Valletta, here. And then I'm going to show you something from over here, over by the Dingley Cliffs, which are completely wild and uninhabited and used to be a major pirate cove. And so one of the things I did when I was in Malta is go see this cave. Our Il Kabir is Maltese for big cave. And the big cave was filled with troglodytes who were servants in the palace of the Grand Inquisitor in the 17th century. And they were visited by another of the weirdos that I'm fond of, Father Athanasius Kircher, who, because he could speak Arabic, could converse with the troglodytes of Malta. And so he goes on and on about the troglodytes. And they're vegetarians. He gave them a meat banquet, and they didn't like it. They wanted their cheese. And in fact, Maltese cheese is a fine thing and another of those things to be recommended. So I ended up bushwhacking in what's left of these caves. They were blown up by the British in 1824 because they didn't think people should be cave dwellers. And there were sneak re-inhabitations, but now everything's fallen apart to the point that you can no longer easily be a troglodyte. But I'll talk today about research that I did in the National Library, which is still where every man of a certain age in Malta goes to read his morning paper. And so it's a strange social place. You can see the two big coffee shops of Valletta, the capital of Malta, are right underneath. And so it's extremely pleasant. You spend your day going between Cafe Cordina and the National Library with its neoclassical design. And here's the interior where the research was performed, except for, as we'll see, the on-site investigations. Giorgio Grognet de Vasse had a crazy idea. He was Maltese, and he decided that Malta was the lost island of Atlantis. As you saw, Malta's not very big, and Atlantis, and the descriptions that Plato furnishes of it, is much larger. And so he had to remap the Mediterranean in ancient times. And so what you have here is the gigantic presence of Atlantis. And then you can see how the capital city, Melita, became Malta when it was devoured by a tsunami 9,000 years before the early days of Athens, which is what Plato tells us. And all of it's contained in this little manuscript book with lots of watercolors from Grognet de Vasse. And I decided I needed an excuse to work on it. And the best excuse I could possibly have was when a dear friend of mine was first diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease and then died of it, unfortunately, before we wrote a book for him. And so he's having to read it from heaven. That was Brian Curran, who may be known to any of you who worked on Egyptian revival. He wrote the Egyptian Renaissance. And he was the reader for my book about Forger from Volterra, Italy, the Scarth of Scornello. And you're not supposed to write on people's manuscripts, But Brian was just so ecstatic at one point when the forgery I was writing about was unmasked by a Vatican scripter. And so he wrote, "Alachi kicks it," in the margin of the manuscript. And that was that. And this was the perfect Brian subject. And I'm sure that Brian has enjoyed it from his better life where he is now. And it was just the perfect thing. So off I went to Malta to look at this manuscript. As you can see, the writing of it did not beautify Giorgio Grognet. He was not a handsome man. He was not a tall man. And their descriptions of him right before his death saying a decrepit little man shuffles around the streets of Valletta and you'd never know that it's the great Giorgio Grognet de Vasse. At the time, Malta was under British domination. I guess I should say briefly that when Grognet was born, Malta was under the domination of the Knights Hospitallers of St. John of Jerusalem, Rhodes, and Malta. So it was a military order dedicated to keeping the seas clean of infidels, which mostly meant Turkish warships, Turkish pirates, with the occasional Greek thrown in. And so one of the most recent books about the Knights calls them Catholic pirates in the Mediterranean. And in a lot of ways, that's what they were. They also had temporal rule over a population of international people. The Knights were drawn from all the noble houses of Europe. You had to have 4/4 of nobility in your family tree going back 3 generations to be eligible, unless, like the artist Caravaggio, you became a special knight where your talents made you capable of having lower. Caravaggio was a gentleman, but he was the very bottom rung of the noble ladder. And so his skill as a painter got him nearly inducted. Unfortunately, he got into a drunken brawl with 5 other knights 2 days before he was inducted, and he spent the night of the induction ceremony in the drunk tank, not even in Valletta, in the old capital, Birgu, and then escaped to Sicily afterwards. After that, briefly, Napoleon took over, and so you have 6 months of rule by Napoleon, and then Napoleon's troops were thrown out by the British, who were invited by, among other people, Grognet de Vasse's father. And that will turn out to be important. So here are his parents. They were very fancy Maltese aristocrats. And his mother particularly was a famous beauty. And you can see her wearing the traditional Maltese headdress, but she's brought it back behind her head to show off her due. And you can see his father was marginally better looking than he was. They were very proper, very Catholic, and they sent their son, who was born in 1774, off to seminary in Frascati in Italy, because at that point, the lingua franca of Malta was Italian. And so here what you have is the street, St. Dominic Street, where Giorgio Grognet de Vasse was born. The name Grognet de Vasse is a French Huguenot name. They were French Protestants who were feudal landlords, and they were thrown out by Louis XIV. Some of them went to England, and so they're Grognet de Vasses in England. And these Grognet de Vasses went down to Malta, became Catholic again, and joined the local aristocracy. But it means that they have international ties. And what you see here is the street. It's right by the Church of St. Paul's Shipwreck, because St. Paul, famously in the Acts of the Apostles, was shipwrecked on Malta and treated well by the barbarians of the place. And here you see the festival of St. Paul's Shipwreck. The Maltese love festivals because it's such a small island that you've got to do something. They love marching bands, but the towns are so small that the marching bands march in place, because otherwise you'd be out of town on the first song. And so you'll see them just marching in place and blasting away with Sousa marches. They all look like real Mediterraneans because they're basically of Arabic descent, and their language is of Arabic base with Italian and English loan words, which means in the course of a single Maltese sentence, you can use all of those. Thank you's grazie. Good morning is merhaba. And if you want to say, I'll pick you up at 7, you say, I will pick you at 7. It's just a fabulous language. And I keep thinking I'll retire there and just learn Maltese for fun. So here what you have is a postcard showing the seminary where Giorgio Grognet de Vasse studied when he was in Frascati, Italy. It was bombed by the Allies in World War II, and so it no longer exists. But he was here, and the library has been preserved. And so here you see the library where he was trying to be a seminarian, but he arrived right at the time of the French Revolution. And by the time he'd become a more advanced student, he decided Napoleon sounded like a really great guy. And so he wrote to his father and said, I'm sorry, I don't want to be a priest anymore. I want to be a Republican. Father went ballistic. They came to an arrangement where Giorgio finally came home, took minor clerical orders until he stowed away on a ship of Napoleon's, ended up at Corfu, and then joined Napoleon's Corps of Engineers. And so he was in Napoleon's Corps of Engineers until 1814, when Napoleon ran into trouble. And he tried to make it then as an architect in Rome for a few years, and then he really needed money. And so he reconciled yet again with his father, but his mother wouldn't let a Jacobin and follower of Napoleon live in their house. And so he moved to a lodging house in Valletta that was run by a couple who had 7 children. The landlord died and he married his landlady. And so now he's got 7 children and he's got to support them. And he can't be a priest anymore because he's married and has these 7 kids by his former landlord. But he was a man who looked for trouble in his life. And so you end up almost feeling sorry for him. During the time that he was studying in Frascati, he was struck by this wall in Tusculum, the ruins of the city where Cicero had one of his famous villas. And this kind of masonry reminded him a lot of the masonry that he'd seen back in the old temples of his home country, Malta. And this was precisely the period when people in the early 19th century were beginning to get interested in prehistoric architecture everywhere. And Malta has a lot of it. There's a place called Hajar Im, and this is Grognet's drawing of Hajar Im, but Hajar Im was excavated in the 1830s. And so he probably was able to look around and see some of these excavations and was struck by the monumentality of old Maltese architecture. And he decided at some point in this trajectory that it must have been built by the people of Atlantis. And here's Hajar Im as it was a few years ago. They now put a big, ugly tent over it to preserve it, which I think is dreadful. But here's what Grognet saw, a little less covered by dirt. And here again is his remapping of the Mediterranean to make sure that you understand that Atlantis once took up most of what the Mediterranean Sea is today. And the magic city that Plato talks about was none other than a city in old Atlantis, maybe where Hajar Im was. The thing about Atlantis is it appears in 2 dialogues of Plato. So here's Raphael's image of Plato holding his dialogue, the Timaeus, which talks about Atlantis. And I am one of the people who thinks Plato made it up. And he made it up for deliberate purposes. But a lot of people from the time of Aristotle, when Plato was still alive, wanted to believe it, because Aristotle writes at one point and says, what's wrong with these people? He made it up. And so Aristotle, Plato's student, is already complaining. So it's one of those things that just got totally out of hand. Atlantis ran away from Plato, and people have been looking for it ever since, including a whole team of insane Maltese who are still looking for it and think they've found it, who are alive today and write weird things on the internet about what they've discovered. So it didn't stop people from looking for, I said, Aristotle's already complaining. My favorite theory of Atlantis before Giorgio Grognet is Olof Rudbeck of Uppsala, Sweden. And here you see Rudbeck, who was the physician, rector magnificus of the university, chief purveyor of herring, fire chief, and every other architect of the anatomical theater, and general entrepreneur of Uppsala. And just a great guy. And here's Rudbeck peeling back the surface of the earth to reveal its Atlantic heritage, which began, of course, in Sweden. Noah's Ark took off from Sweden. The Trojan War was the second great Swedish invasion of the world after the first great Swedish invasion, which happened with the Tower of Babel. And so he's not for the faint of heart. And here, in fact, if I can reverse this, you see people drinking the waters of Atlantic revelation, and some of them are barfing because it's just more than they can take. So you've got people who are intoxicated by recognizing the Atlantic nature of Sweden, and then people throwing up because it's just more than they can stomach. And of course, Rudbeck is correct. I say as a Swedish American, it's just very obvious that Grognet de Vasse is trying to arrogate to Malta something that is Sweden's by right. He fell in, and during either his time with Napoleon or his time in Rome, with a man who has one of those French hyphenated names, which are usually Jean-Louis or something, but here's Agricole Joseph François Xavier Pierre Esprit Simon Paul Antoine Marquis Fortiat d'Urban, who was interested in foreign languages, among other things, and so he knew Phoenician. And that allowed the two of them, and he wrote learned treatises by the bucketful, one of which I've been using for my continuing interest in the great 15th century forger Annius of Viterbo, about whom I will not talk now because we have to talk about crazies of the 19th century. And so the two of Grognet de Vasse and Fortiat d'Urban forged a Phoenician inscription that was found on Malta, in which the name Atlantis appears. And Fortiat d'Urban presented it in Paris to first great acclaim and then great controversy. The original inscription, sadly, like some of the other texts that the two of them found, were lost at sea shortly after they were able to record them and write. And they had a Greek friend who was pretty strange too. And they continued corresponding with each other, and they ended up being able to decipher the primordial Atlantic alphabet from which all alphabets descend. And so here what we've got are Atlantic words. And there was even an Atlantic club you could join in Malta for a certain sum. President, of course, Giorgio Grognet de Vasse, treasurer, Giorgio Grognet de Vasse, maker of the certificate you got as a member of the Atlantic Club, watercolor by Giorgio Grognet de Vasse. And what we need to look at very carefully is this profoundly symbolic form. And there's Atlantis, and he's wearing an Egyptian pharaoh's headdress. And the reason I actually came across the manuscript in the first place is that everywhere I go, if it's a strange library, I look for what they have on the Etruscans and find bizarre things. And what I found was the Etruscan origins, or the origins of the Etruscans in Atlantis, which is really Malta, by Giorgio Grognet de Vasse. And here's your membership card if you should desire to join the Atlantic Academy. It's not clear to me that anybody except his family joined the Atlantic Academy, but you could. It was there for you. And here you've got a revelation of primordial Atlantic architecture. This is the great architecture of the great lost civilization that Plato assures us was better than anything else that's ever happened since. Though 10,000 years ago, this is what we were capable of, or if we were Maltese in the Mediterranean, this is what we could do. And it's all based on a form that he discerns called the Kabiric spiral. It comes from a relief that was picked up by the French in Samothrace at the same time they picked up the Winged Victory and brought them to the Louvre. And Grognet just went crazy about that spiral. The Kabiroi are a mystery cult of the ancient world, and because we know very little about them, the imagination can fill out, and the Kabiroi can become anything that you want. But they're a kind of ecstatic wine cult, as far as we can tell. And there's Grognet's drawing. Once he started looking for Kabiric spirals, he found them all over Malta. Though he found them particularly in the prehistoric ruins. And so he made this whole theory that this was the sign of Atlantis. And of course, it had all kinds of cult attachments. And they really do exist in these prehistoric temples of Malta. It is one of the big signs. And so one of the insane websites I was consulting is a modern goddess cult evocation, or the modern goddess cult thinks the Kabiric spiral is all this feminist religion because they're not only Atlantis crazies going around Malta, they're goddess cult crazies going around Malta. And so the Maltese have a lot of fun amusing themselves with various kinds of tourists. And then this is another excerpt from another prehistoric complex. This one's called Tarshan. And he decides that a bishop's crook is not, as I've probably told a lot of you, descended from an Etruscan augur's wand. It's a Kabiric spiral. And Ionic capitals, you think are Ionic, but they're not. They're Atlantic. So you've got it now. You've heard the truth about where Ionic architecture comes from. It comes from Atlantis. It's older than anything else. All that stuff the Greeks tell you about Doric, that's because the Greeks, as Plato reminds us in the Timaeus, usurped credit for a lot of civilization from the Atlantids. So now you know the truth. And I hope this will inform your practice and make you realize where you should go. Even curls on people's armor or their helmets, he's finding Kabiric spirals everywhere. And the wings of griffins end up in a spiral. So you can see what happens frequently with crackpot research. All evidence is good evidence. There's no discrimination of good evidence from far-fetched evidence. Everything works. And wait till you see. So things like this partial grave marker, which I think he probably saw in the Louvre and is probably from around Athens, is really a Kabiric spiral instead of handles of a wedding vessel. This is a kind of vessel called a lutrophorus, and young girls were often buried with a lutrophorus on their grave. And palmettes have curls. So here's an Atlantic palmette, because you know how they have the palm leaves, but they've got that spiral. So you can see how many, and this is his fanciful reconstruction of Etruscan architecture taken from one of the standard handbooks of the 18th century by Francesco Ingirami. And then he notes that the Sicilian Greek sites that we think of as Greek architecture really reflect their Atlantic roots. So there's the colossal temple in Agrigento, which he here reconstructs. And here we see it more or less as he would have seen it. So this is a 19th century photograph before Agrigento was all built up, and you have the huge temple platform. And here's baby Atlas, Atlante Bambino, which he swears is from the metopes of what we now call Temple C at Selinunte. I can't find Atlante Bambino. I think Atlante Bambino is another case of evidence that's been slightly altered to fit his theory, because we've got Perseus slaying Medusa, though there's nobody with folded arms, to be Atlante Bambino. And this is Athena and Perseus, so we have grown-ups, a god and a grown-up hero. And then this hilarious one, this is Hercules or Heracles taking these two loudmouth bad boys called the Kerkopes, and they're chattering away, and he's sick of them, and so he slings them over their shoulder, and then they make fun of how hairy his rear end is, and so here he's standing, and they're making fun of his rear end, and this is what they put on. And this isn't baby Atlas either. And the other two have women, so you've got a winged chariot and processions of goddesses. So where did baby Atlas come from? I don't know. So have to go to Palermo and see if there's something from Selinunte that might pass. Or else he could have made it up. One of the great discussions, how do I save myself from this? Oh, maybe it's okay. I've never used a ThinkPad before. It's just, we have to go back a couple more. There. Oh, wait, now two more. Sorry. Yeah, that's right. So here's his reconstruction of the temple at Dendera. And one of the questions is, did he go to Egypt with Napoleon, or did he just stay with the Corps of Engineers elsewhere? And here he's drawing a Greek temple that's on the Nile Delta, which suggests if he didn't go, at least he's got information from fellow members of Napoleon's Corps of Engineers who did go on Napoleon's Egyptian expedition. And here's the temple as it is today. And on the basis of Sicilian Greek architecture, his fantasy, and Egyptian architecture, he comes up with the paradigmatic Atlantic temple with the Eye of God and the Kabiric spiral and Phoenician inscriptions all over it. And because he's a good architect, although we don't know where he went to architecture school or if he did, here's plan. We saw elevation, and we have longitudinal section with statue of somebody wearing an Egyptian headdress looking like a pharaoh and holding the trident of Poseidon. So it's Temple of Neptune, who's obviously the right person to be the god of Atlantis. And here's a priest of Neptune, god of Atlantis. It's drawn from the equally crazy fantasies of my friend Father Athanasius Kircher, who went to Malta in 1637 and published many things, including an eyewitness description of his time with the troglodytes. So that's one aspect of Grognet's career, one that may not have been wildly successful. But in the 1830s, he got a commission to build a new parish church in a little village called Mosta. And he decided to build a pantheon. The bishop, who had last faced off the French and Napoleon with Grognet's father, where they chased Napoleon out and called in the British Navy to take over Malta, did not look well on the elder Grognet's Napoleon-loving son. And so he tried to block Grognet's project for years. He finally was allowed to do it, but it took 35 years to build it. And during the whole process of building it, the previous Baroque church was inside the Great Dome. And the dome of the Rotunda of Mosta for many years was the third largest unsupported dome in the world after the Pantheon and St. Peter's. So it's big. Here's his plan. I'm sorry for the bad photographs. I was trying to get them bootleg. And here's the rotunda going up in a contemporary photograph. And here it is completed in Mosta as it was. So it absolutely dwarfs everything else around it. Malta is not a rich country at all. It's really, people live very simply, and so this giant dome just appeared out of nowhere, and it's not been repeated anywhere. And here you can see it with that nice lion out in front. And here it's clearly modeled on the Pantheon with its dome. And I think it's also modeled on Bernini's Santa Maria Assunta, because the Mosta Rotunda is dedicated to the Assumption of the Virgin, as is Bernini's church, and Ariccia, where this church is not far from Frascati. So certainly Grognet saw this, and he would have seen Bernini's dome, which you see here. And here's Mosta on August 15th. And as I said, the Maltese just love parties more than anything. And petards, so they launch stink bombs all day and all night and go completely crazy. All the columns of the interior are wrapped in brocades. And here you see even the exterior columns are wrapped in special cloth, and confetti litters the streets, and the marching bands march in place, and everybody has a splendid time. And there it is again. I went here a couple of times with graduate students and Stephen Peterson would say, it's just awful. It's so crude. And it is more rough and ready. It's all made of local limestone by local artisans. It's really regular people. But the last time I went, I realized its great secret. It's Atlantic. It's got Atlantic spirals out your ears. And everywhere you look, you can see that Mr. Atlantic Spiral is putting the Christian tradition and Christian architecture into the great tradition of Atlantis, and showing how Malta is still preserving these great religious insights. And so I was going crazy with my Maltese friend. Look at this, it's the Atlantic spiral. And he pointed out, if you stand under the dome spirals. So it's not a Pantheon dome or a Santa Maria Assunta dome. It's a spiral dome, and it's the Kabiric spiral. Furthermore, you've got this palmette motif, which we last saw poking up from Kabiric spirals. And all the domes have it. And that seems to come from what he identified as an Ionic capital, which you see here in his drawing, which he says he found in Syracuse. It's Capitello Atlantico a Siracusa. So obviously I had to go to Syracuse and find the Atlantic capital. And so off I went to Ortigia, which you all probably remember fondly. And the capital, we didn't find but a twin of it. This was one of 3 such capitals pulled from a drain in Syracuse that are surely the mates of the one that Grognet found. And then I found some really beat up limestone ones in the backyard of the Archaeological Museum. Well, if you've been on a Grognet de Vasse pilgrimage to go find an Atlantic capital, and you walk into the Archaeological Museum of Syracuse, the first thing that hits you in prehistoric Syracuse is a Kabiric spiral. And so I started going crazy because Syracuse is Kabiric spiral city. And then you've got this insane grave marker where you've got Doric, and then you've got in heraldic position in the front of a tympanum, a Kabiric. This is obviously not an Ionic capital. This is an Atlantic capital with a palmette, and then you've got Kabiric spirals up above. And so it's all true. And here's another one. And from this, I conclude that he was nuts. He can drive you nuts if you work on him too much. I've used him, so I wrote my article for Brian, and it amused everybody to death. I gave a talk using him to a conference on forgery where I talked about forgery as conceptual art and took it from Anius of Viterbo, this 15th century forger, to Ai Weiwei, who's been playing around with forgery, and used him as my centerpiece, all of which doesn't tell you a whole lot edifying, but research is also like that because you can go in with a guaranteed outcome. You can go in not knowing what you're going to find, and you never really know what's going to come in handy. So that, for example, my dad's research was undertaken without thinking where he was going. It just so happened that one day a question he wanted answered had immense environmental impact. And he found out, he wanted to know where fluorocarbons went after they left spray cans. And it turned out they went to the atmosphere and ate the ozone layer. And he decided that was the kind of thing that you don't just sit and say, oh, that's fascinating. He thought he really had to do political action. And so he was instrumental in producing the first international environmental agreement, the Montreal Protocols of 1987. And it's not because he was looking to do that. It's because he just wondered where Freon went. I don't think this is going to be of the same earth-shattering importance. And so the only thing concrete I can give you from this experience, except go to Malta, it's really fun, is that when you're doing a reasoned argument from evidence, you have to be very careful and be critical about your evidence. Don't just throw everything in, or you'll end up like me in the Archaeological Museum of Syracuse saying, yes, the Kabiric spiral is here. Syracuse was clearly connected to Atlantis, and it was, if not the capital, which was obviously in Uppsala, at least it was a subsidiary. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for this thought-provoking talk that you gave. I see all the smiles. Probably there are questions out there from what you heard today. Anybody has any questions? Yes.
Yeah, aside from, thank you for the presentation, really nice. Aside from Aristotle's critique of Atlantis, are there any other things that you would say that lead you to believe that it's, pomposity, the myth,
because it's serving a specific purpose in Plato. And so Plato has Solon, who was probably a really old, his mother's descended from Solon, and he probably never knew Solon, but he's somebody in the family who's really old. And Solon is talking, saying, we Athenians just don't know how old history really is. We think it goes back to the Egyptians, but 9,000 years before anything that we know about, there was this great war between Atlantis and Athens. And then Atlantis got swallowed up. And then what he does is give a tale of civilization, where he says that the Atlantids were civilized, they observed justice, they had good laws, everybody lived with moderation, and then they got corrupt. And when they became corrupt, they became blasphemous, and they outraged the gods, and the gods, especially Poseidon, sent a tsunami and ditched them. And Plato's writing as somebody who grew up as Athens was engaged in what turned out to be a suicidal war with Sparta, that has an offshoot where they're not even thinking about the great Western power, Syracuse. And so in Plato's lifetime, Athens goes from being one of the major powers of the Mediterranean to being defeated by Sparta, falling apart. It has an oligarchic coup. And so I take Atlantis as a way of talking about Athens without getting in trouble, because he's talking about his own city. And so what he does is take this famous figure from early Athens and say, look, this has all happened before. And he puts it in fictitious territory. So the way I read it is that Atlantis is a symbol of the Athens that he watched decline and fall. And Plato's hard to read, or a lot of people misread Plato. And one of the things that drives me crazy is the great promoter of Plato in the Renaissance was somebody named Marsilio Ficino, who I think is one of the worst readers of Plato ever. And he just doesn't get it at all. And it means that generations afterwards, because he was persuasive, read Plato in the same insanely misleading way. And I think frequently the problem is that people don't read Plato as a writer of dialogues that are like plays. And so Solon's saying something, that doesn't mean Plato believes it. He's telling a story. And a lot of times Plato tells a story about an untrue thing based on a true thing to make a point about a true thing. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? I actually had one, and that was based on what you were saying. The reliefs that you showed us, they're from, am I pronouncing this right? Calbric reliefs? No.
So he calls it Kabiric.
Kabiric
and it's something he made up.
Okay. Oh, so it's also, so the connection between Kabiric and Atlantis, what is that?
And so he thinks that the Kabiroi came from, and he calls it, the last time I gave a talk, I just used Atlantis instead of Kabiric and say that it was an Atlantic spiral, but actually he calls it Kabiric because then it's this ancient mystery cult. And so he thinks they were the first practitioners of the mystery cult. And it all goes back to that one relief with the two figures and what's probably the side of a couch from the side of a Samothracian couch springs this fantasy of our Atlantic heritage. The evidence for which you can see super abounds in Sicily. So you can make a whole almost plausible fake argument based on fake evidence to prove a point that I don't believe for a second. Then think about all those people writing about the origins of Doric. And tell me where their theories are better than this. And I will argue with evidence that they are on the same plane, going the same place.
I have a question. Well, two questions. First, did you notice the geometry of the podium you're standing behind? The second question is, you opened and ended your talk today describing perhaps the dangers of doing research and falling into confirmation bias. What mechanisms do you use to protect or guard against your own confirmation bias?
Well, in this case, because a divine sign has come down to show that actually it was all true. Skepticism, which I'm sometimes not really very good at. And it turns out that definitions of skepticism in my career as first a graduate student and then a young scholar were really gender biased. So if a woman thought it was crazy. If a man thought it was creative. And then what happens is that if you're around screaming in the wilderness long enough, by now, it's just Ingrid doing her thing. And I keep thinking I'm going to be stoned for saying things, and it turns out no. And so somehow I learned to be judicious. I'm not sure, it's probably all the stonings that I received pounded me into some kind of rationality. A lot of it is just making sure your evidence really does confirm your hypothesis. And it's one of the things where it's really hard in art schools or architectures. I mean, how do you confirm a hypothesis? With a building, you could say it stands or not, but how do you say it's beautiful with evidence? Does it make you feel good? Lillian Hellman ran out of Frank Gehry's house because she hated it so much. It was totally visceral because apparently she went to a dinner party and she first went into the bathroom and then she just ran away. And I felt sort of the same way in Bilbao because you just feel claustrophobic. The architecture made you want to go out, but the part of you that's wanting to go out isn't rational enough. And so it's harder with art school to do this. In arts and letters, it's kind of a given of graduate education. Law, it's the same way. And so it turns out that a lot of people who are in classics, as I was as an undergraduate, do really well in law school because it's law, you're making argument with more stuff than you are usually in Greek archaeology. And one of the reasons I got out of Greek archaeology into Renaissance stuff is there was more evidence. The stuff was as fictitious as Plato that they were saying. And so that's why all these architecture theories usually point to something larger. So with Vitruvius, his Doric theory is to show that good architecture is based on nature. And so there's that point where he paints himself into his theoretical corner and he says, when nature designed the constellations, she drew them from nature. This is what we call tautology in logic. And of course, she drew them from nature, but the fact that nature has to draw from nature shows how important it is to him that design be drawn from nature.
You know, Libeskind's work in Berlin on the Jewish Museum, as you go in, it's meant to be very cold and harsh, and it's meant to be very rough on you. And it's a modern building, and it's still something that gets what it needs. It's meant to have that purpose, or that impact on you because of the way the museum reflects a theme. So depending on what you're trying to reach, but it's still an emotional caliber. It's not something that's an evidence-based research like what Ingrid was talking about. So yeah, maybe archaeology, some of it should be part of what architects think, not always separating us from everything else. We should connect ourselves with history and archaeology more.
And I guess a concept that's really helped me over the years was something my friend Sally's father wrote a book called Narrative Truth and Historical Truth. Mm. And what he found as a psychiatrist is that his patients always wanted to tell him a story. And so they didn't mean to lie about their lives, but they shaped their lives because they felt if they didn't tell him a good story that had a beginning, end, and resolution, then they were cheating him as a patient. They weren't being good patients if they didn't give him narrative. And then he started thinking about myths and how myths tell you the truth, whether or not there was a real Oedipus who killed his father and married his mother. As Freud noticed, there's substance in the idea. He wanted to kill his father. And he probably thought his mother was not a bad specimen of a woman. And so sometimes you can tell a story that's fictitious and tell the truth at the same time. And so that's what Donald P. Spence was his name, and he wrote this. And for me, that's a really good way to look at Plato, where Plato's often telling you narrative truth rather than historical truth, because if he tells historical truth, he's going to go to jail.
On that point, I think, thank you guys. I know you'll have to go to studio. I would thank Professor Rowland for taking the time.
Thank you for the audio visual.
And being with us here today. Thank you guys.